The Horror Hostel. It was a rainy evening when Sophie arrived at the old rundown hostel on the outskirts of town. She had recently moved to the city for her studies, and due to the high cost of renting a place, she had no choice but to book a room at the only affordable hostel she could find. The building was ancient, with creaky floors and faded wallpaper that had seen better days. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the dim lighting only made the atmosphere more oppressive. As Sophie entered the reception, the elderly woman behind the counter gave her an unsettling, tight-lipped smile. "Room 13, second floor," she said in a rasping voice that seemed to echo in the stillness of the hostel. Sophie nodded, trying to hide her discomfort, and took the key. The corridors of the hostel were narrow and dim, with flickering light bulbs that barely illuminated the way. The second floor felt unnaturally cold, as though a chill clung to the walls. Sophie reached her room and hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. She pushed it open and found herself in a small, sparse room with a single bed, an old wooden wardrobe, and a desk covered in dust. The bed's sheets were rumpled, as if someone had recently been in it. Sophie shuddered, but dismissed the thought, too tired to care. The room felt eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the rain hammering against the window. Sophie unpacked her things quickly and tried to settle in. As she looked around the room, she couldn't help but feel like she was being watched. A strange unease settled in her chest, but she pushed it aside, telling herself she was simply imagining things. The building was old, after all, and old buildings often made strange noises. Just as Sophie lay down to sleep, she heard it, a soft tapping, like fingernails gently drumming against wood. At first, she thought it was the rain, but then the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It came from above her, as if someone was pacing back and forth. Her heart began to race, and she pulled the covers tighter around her, trying to ignore the sounds. But then came a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sophie's eyes snapped open, her pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, and Sophie could hear muffled footsteps, slow and dragging, moving in rhythm with the scratching. Panic surged through her. She got up and crept toward the door, half expecting someone to be waiting on the other side. She opened it slowly, cautiously, but the hallway was empty. The faint yellow light from the ceiling barely illuminated the worn carpet beneath her feet. A thick, oppressive silence hung in the air. Reluctantly, Sophie turned back to her room, only to find the wardrobe door slightly ajar. She hadn't opened it. The air around her seemed to grow colder, as if the room was trying to warn her. Hesitating for a moment, she approached the wardrobe. Her fingers brushed against the door, and with a deep breath, she pulled it open. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. She sighed in relief, thinking it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, out of the corner of her eye, Sophie saw something moving in the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, in a tattered nightgown. She froze. The woman stood perfectly still, her long hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she backed away slowly. She reached for the door, but the figure raised her head and slowly stepped forward, her hollow dark eyes locking onto Sophie's. Sophie stumbled backward, her hands shaking as she tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure took another slow step, its movements jerky, unnatural. A faint, rasping voice echoed in Sophie's mind. "Don't open it." The warning was chilling, and Sophie turned, running toward the door to escape. But it slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang, trapping her inside. The woman in the nightgown began to move toward her, her limbs contorted, her body unnaturally twisted. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as the figure crawled along the floor, dragging herself with a terrible, gurgling noise. Sophie's feet felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the spot in terror. She tried to scream, but her throat tightened and no sound came. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into pitch darkness. The air was thick with a coldness that felt like it was seeping into her bones. In the suffocating silence, Sophie heard the woman's voice again, whispering, "You should never have come." Sophie's mind raced as she scrambled for the door, her fingers fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The hostel seemed to close in on her, as if the walls were moving, shifting, trapping her in an inescapable nightmare. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she turned to look around the room for another way out. In the blackness, she could hear the sound of footsteps, muffled but unmistakable, pacing around her. Each step made her blood run cold. The faint whispering grew louder, as if voices from the walls themselves were closing in on her. She turned desperately, hoping to see something that would make sense, but only shadows and darkness greeted her. The door to the hallway suddenly creaked open, and Sophie rushed toward it, desperate to escape. But as she crossed the threshold, the walls seemed to bend and twist, the corridor elongating unnaturally. The stairs were no longer where they should be, and every direction felt wrong. Sophie's legs were heavy, her head dizzy, as if the hostel itself was shifting its shape to confuse her. The noise of distant footsteps became more frantic, and she realized that she was not alone. Panicked and disoriented, Sophie stumbled into the reception area, her body shaking from fear. But when she reached the desk, the elderly woman was sitting there, waiting, as though she had been expecting Sophie's arrival. There was no warmth in the woman's smile this time. She only said, "Room 13 is not a place for the living." Sophie turned to run, but as she glanced back, she saw the figure of the woman in the tattered nightgown standing at the end of the hall. Her eyes locked onto Sophie's, and a cold, unsettling voice whispered, "Welcome to the hostel." The door slammed shut behind her, and as the rain continued to pour, Sophie was never seen again. Some say her spirit still haunts the hostel, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest to check in.